Hello again to anyone who decides to watch this thing. So this is actually going to be the second, I believe. I do know because I did the first one yesterday. Anyway, this will be the second of the informal discussions, which I believe I've labeled Talky Talk for whatever reason I decided that was a good idea. So, last time we spoke about a couple of environmental aspects. This time we're going to be speaking about something quite different. So the work, not all of it, just the two books actually, by a good old man by the name of Albert Memmi. I don't know why, but for a long time I thought it was Alfred Memmi, but oh well. Also, I don't know if it's entirely pronounced Memmi. I looked up like a bunch of videos to see the correct pronunciation, and it seems correct. I don't know. I don't want to mispronounce certain people's names. I'll mispronounce some people's names, not others. So, Albert Memmi, who was a French-Tunisian writer, so North Africa. For those who don't know where Tunisia is, it's basically right next door to Egypt, but on the more so west side. And he was a novelist, but I've never read any of his novels, I'm afraid. I've only read the more academic stuff, where he wrote one really, really important book, and then about 50 years later, he wrote, or 50 years later, published the, almost like a sequel. So we're talking about both of those books. The one is called The Colonizer and The Colonized. That's the more famous one, which was published in, is it 1957? Let me just double check. 1957, yeah, 1957. And then also we'll be talking about the second book, which is Decolonization and the Decolonized. That was 2006, more so. Now, also there might be some noise in the background. I hope not, because there are people actually like working outside, making some noise. Earlier they were doing welding, and now I hear a plane, because of course it waits. It always waits for when I'm recording. So yeah, this will be very informal. It's not scripted, which also means that there is no transcript for this. Usually I make transcripts for all my videos, but look at the video that sort of introduces this series. Will explain the reasons why if you don't know them. So, basically, the colonizer and the colonizer and the colonized, his first big sort of non-fiction book, because novelist, but don't know those. And essentially this is it's post-colonialism, so it's about colonization. Now he wrote the first one pretty much like before the big independence movement really kicked off. Like things were kicking off at the time, but I don't think any countries were really independent yet. Now his work is often read in conjunction with Frantz Fanon's work, which I will probably also do a video on. Because they go together really, really well. According to Wikipedia, it's also often read with this other guy's work, but I don't know this other person, but for the sake of checking it out, it's often read in conjunction with Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism. I have not read that one. Maybe I should also read that one and add it to the list. But judging by his Wikipedia page, he did things like he wrote like a response to Shakespeare's The Tempest and stuff, which is an interesting discussion point for colonialism. So definitely an interesting point there. I'm sure he also is a fantastic writer. Now, Memmi is writing from the perspective of a colonized person. He was a Tunisian Jewish man, and as he says here, it's on page 4 in the preface. He says, "I was Tunisian, therefore colonized. I discovered that few aspects of my life and my personality were untouched by this fact. Not only my own thoughts, my passions, and my conduct, but also the conduct of others towards me was affected." So he's basically he's going to be talking about colonization. And that's what we're going to be talking about here as well. So one of his fundamental aspects is talking about privilege, and actually he does respond in this like preface, which was from after it was published. He does talk about how some people criticized him for not stressing the economic factor of it, of colonialism, of like essentially the capitalist factor. So he does say that, no, listen, all privilege, which is a fundamental aspect here of privilege, the privilege of the colonizer, is fundamentally economic. So he does say, even though he doesn't say it necessarily in the text, he does say it here. Now, this seemed to happen quite a lot, actually, because Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous existentialist and Marxist philosopher, he actually wrote an introduction to this book. And he also wrote an introduction, I believe, to Wretched of the Earth. I'm now speaking off the cuff, but one of Frantz Fanon's books, he did write the introduction for, and I think it was Wretched of the Earth. So yeah, now he is quite an aggressive writer a lot of the time. And for instance, he says this is quite a great thing to talk about, how colonialism inherently is about repression and everything. So he says, yeah, on page 20 of his introduction, page 20, but this is the introduction by him, which says, the colonialist system favors population growth to reduce the cost of labor. I don't know if that sound came through. There was a Skype notification. But it forbids the assimilation of the natives, whose numerical superiority, if they had voting rights, would shatter the system. So, if the colonized actually got the vote, it would completely screw up the whole system. Colonialism denies human rights to human beings whom it has subdued by violence and keeps them by force in a state of misery and ignorance that Marx would rightly call a subhuman condition. Racism is ingrained in actions, institutions, and in the nature of the colonialist methods of production and exchange. He is fundamentally saying that this is an economic thing that Marxist critique can very much apply to colonialism, which I think, if you are at all aware of the actual writings of Vladimir Lenin, he does have a book called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. So this idea that colonialism is an inherently capitalistic system, that is, explored here too. There's also another introduction, a new introduction by Nadine Gordimer, but she does criticize Memmi a little bit for instance, his complete dismissal of colonial leftists, because he's actually very he goes quite after the colonial leftists in his book. So he asks this, or discusses this basically through portraits. So he has these two big portraits that he does. Now, by portrait, it's obviously a written portrait, not an actual picture. There's the portrait of the colonizer and the portrait of the colonized. So he asks several questions, really. These are like the sections in each of these portraits. First of all, asking, does the colonial exist in the first place? Which, yes, it does. And the idea of the colonial in a place that has been colonized, when you go to a place that has been colonized, it is basically rife with images of colonialism. The people who are in charge of the colonial nation are on banknotes. They're glorified. They're shown as like these powerful figures. Not the people who have been colonized, but the colonizer themselves is elevated to this special position. And of course, the colonized places are seen as like, exotic places that, you can go there and we'll make sure that those gosh darn locals don't offer you any troubles. So it's pretty much opening it up for exploitation by colonizers. And he actually does make some distinctions specifically between like special types of colonizer and stuff, but whatever. So he says there are three things that are central to the role of the colonizer. profit, privilege, and usurpation. So profit, obviously, they're ultimately there to make money. They are also there inherently to push their privilege above other people. And they're also there to usurp those who should probably actually become in power. And they even, and this is one of the things about colonialism, it even brings the colonized into itself by, for instance, making colonized people into cops. So you literally have the people who are subjugated helping the subjugators further repress people. It's very fun. It's a very depressing, sad era. Then he discusses the colonizer who refuses. So this is basically a colonial leftist, someone who is on the left, and they want to help. However, no matter how much they essentially embrace it, they end up discovering that there isn't really a place for them in a truly liberated colonial world. Once they, if a colonial leftist helps people to, to get rid of the colonizer, they must still understand that they are still, even if they're a leftist, they are still a colonizer, and that essentially this is not a place for them. They are no longer welcome, even though, say, they might have been, the good guys, the white good people. They are not. It's a deeper kind of a thing where, yes, you helped, but you're still part of the system. You're still a problem. Then there's the idea of the colonizer who accepts. So that's quite obvious. That's like someone who does actually embrace it. And what's quite great is he says the best colonizers, so the people who are actually the best at being colonizers, they either have too much pride to actually be part of it, like they're like, no, this is ridiculous, like this is basically too easy, or it's people who have problems with it, ethical issues with it. So the best people are not actually the colonizers. The people who are left are the mediocre. So essentially he's saying all the colonizers, the ones who stay and colonize a place, are the mediocre members of that colonial nation. They're not the ones who are actually good at something. Like, they're not the really good colonialists. They're the ones that are kind of bad at it. So that's quite fun. He also specifically says, because this was written in the wake of World War II, right? And every nation pretty much went around being like, no, fascism is bad. And he straight up just goes, what are you talking about? You say fascism is bad, yet you have colonies. It is basically fascism. And he says here, what is fascism if not a regime of oppression for the benefit of a few? The entire administrative and political machinery of a colony has no other goal. The human relationships have arisen from the severest exploitation, founded in inequality and contempt, guaranteed by police authoritarianism. There is no doubt in the minds of those who have lived through it that colonialism is one variety of fascism. So, all those basically imperialists who said, oh no, we're like very, very anti-fascists. Well, okay, they wouldn't call themselves that now because that's a different meaning today. But they would say, we're against fascism, but they're not really. They just didn't like that particular form of fascism. So, that's fun. Now, that's the portrait of the colonizer. But what about the portrait of the colonized? So there's this, first off, what he calls the mythical portrait of the colonized. That, first off, for a colonizer to exist, there has to be a colonized. Because otherwise they do not have something to compare themselves to. This is essentially similar to a dialectical way of viewing the world. Maybe one day I'll do something about dialectics. But the idea that you can only define yourself as a colonizer if they are colonized for you to colonize. And they have to make up myths about it, right? They have to be like, okay, listen, the colonized people are obviously like lazy or they're stupid. They have to make up this myth and then try to justify it to justify their existence being there in the first place. I hear possibly a grinder outside. Hopefully no one can hear it. So anyway, and the idea is that they try to push the colonized towards accepting their view of reality, to being like, no, you must accept the fact that you are inferior to us, because they don't actually want them to be fighting back. So this then culminates in obviously the situation of the colonized. Okay, now I can definitely hear like a grinder or something out there. It's being quiet. Okay, the situation of the colonized. So, here's a quote. Since the colonized is presumed a thief, he must in fact be guarded against. Being suspect by definition, why would he not be guilty? Some laundry was stolen, a frequent incident in these sunny lands where the laundry dries in the open air and mocks those who are naked. And who but the first colonized seen in that vicinity can be guilty? Since it may be he, they go to his home and take him to the police station. So pretty much the colonized is already assumed to be guilty of crimes. They are already assumed to be the bad guy. A colonizer does not need to justify their actions because it's a colonized person. So in this case, it would be a black person. It's a black person, and so therefore they must already be guilty. So the thing is that what happens now, because of the myth, right? The myth becomes reinforced in action. And what happens is the colonizer holds all power and authority and all responsibilities on the shoulders of the colonizer. That's because they've made it that way on purpose. But they use that to then justify their treatment of the colonized. Well, we are the ones who have taken all the responsibility. I don't see the colonized doing anything about it, and that's because they've been intentionally excluded. But you can pretend that, oh look, there are no black people here in the government, and so therefore, obviously, they can't do government. That's because they've been intentionally left out. So he says here, when the colonizer effectively holds all power and responsibility, he then says, and this is a quote, the colonized, on the other hand, feels neither responsible nor guilty nor skeptics, for he is out of the game. He is in no way a subject of history anymore. Of course, he carries its burden, often more cruelly than others, but always as an object. So the colonized doesn't get given responsibility, so they don't feel guilt either for anything they've done. Like, colonized people don't need to feel guilty like colonial leftists because they didn't do anything wrong. They are the ones who are wronged. And they don't have to be skeptical of the system because they're not even part of the game. They're not part of this. As he says, he is in no way a subject of history anymore. He's not a subject, he becomes an object of history. The colonized does not get to be a member of it. Intentionally. But of course, this is a vicious cycle because if the people in charge intentionally repress the people who they believe are inferior. So let's say it's like this. All right. People on top, they believe that, so let's say white people and black people. The white people think, oh, black people are inferior. So we're going to give them lesser education, give them lesser housing, lesser opportunities. And then what happens is those black people obviously do not succeed in the same way as white people. And then that circles back and the white people go, see, look at that. They're lazy, they're uneducated, blah, 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 blah. But these are things that the colonizer did. So it's not actually them, like it's not that the colonized are stupid or something. It's because they've been intentionally repressed. So that's what he talks about here. So it's very, very fun. And everything about him is in some way deficient, right? The colonized is kept deficient on purpose. Less education, they're poorly fed, etc., etc. Everything about them has to be considered lower so that the colonizer can justify his actions. So, he pretty much ends off with, before the conclusion, he ends off with the two answers of the colonized. There's two ways that they can do this. How do we do it? Okay. You can either assimilate, right? Become part of the culture. Leave your culture behind and become the colonized as the colonizer wants you to be, right? Which will probably make it easier on you. If you just accept the discrimination, it will probably be a bit easier for you to stomach it. It's not a good thing, and you shouldn't be doing that. But if you just basically give up, then you no longer feel hope. Probably not the best way to go about it. That's why he says the other response is revolt, rising against it through violence if necessary, and violence will probably be very much necessary. So yeah, those are like the two things that he says that the colonizer can do: either give up and assimilate, or fight back. And now, as he says in his conclusion, the mere existence of the colonizer creates oppression, and only the complete liquidation of colonization permits the colonized to be free. Only when there is no colonization can the colonizer, or the colonized, be free. So that's quite depressing. That's kind of the end of that book. Now that book, obviously tells quite an angry book, which a lot of post-colonial stuff is. Very, very understandably so. And now he wrote that, 1957, and there is a plane flying overhead. Let's just listen to the plane. Let's just ignore it. Okay, planes go away. So his next book, which was published about 50 years later, the plane just has to fly specifically over me. Anyway, I think it's now far enough away. So, anyway, let's ignore the plane, which I haven't been doing, and let's talk about decolonization and the decolonized. So, now it's 2006, fast forward a bit, and he releases another book, sort of a follow-up. You can even tell the name mimics or echoes it, right? Decolonization and the Decolonized, and the last one was called The Colonizer and the Colonized. So, it's quite similar. Now, he's talking here, this book is different. It's very, very different. Because this was kind of by the time that traditional ideas of colonialism had ended, right? He, unlike the other guy who's often considered necessary reading for anti-colonial discussions, which is Frantz Fanon, he died very young. He died before he got to see any of the liberation that occurred. But Memmi did see the liberation occur. And he didn't much like what he saw. So this book is a much different book. This is where the other one is angry. This one is more sad. I'm not going to go into as much detail about it because I don't think it has as much really to say in the same sense as the last one. But when independence finally happened in these countries, right, something had to happen. Someone had to take power. There had to be somebody who would now be the new power. That's just the way it works. And that is where it becomes an unhappy thing. Because, as many of us do know, large sections of Africa and these previously colonized countries are full of things like civil war, corruption, etc. And that's what he basically speaks about here. How corruption is everywhere. Tyrants, religious zealots, and soldiers are everywhere. These groups try to make as many excuses as they can and divert attention away from their problems to look at, the external problems. So the reason the country continues being like it is, he lays a bit of the blame at the feet of the new leaders who have just essentially capitalized on the situation. And he just speaks about all of these. Basically, colonialism as it used to be has ended. So now what? That's essentially the question. Why have things not gotten better? That violence is still everywhere. We do not live in a post-colonial world. Look, we don't. We live still in essentially now what you would call a neo-colonial world, which I don't think he actually uses that term, but that's what it is. It has continued. And he talks about how there are these new citizens versus the immigrants. So new citizens are people who basically became the citizens of these previously colonized countries. And the immigrant are the people that pretty much left, right? And a lot of these people then start to, with the immigrants, they'll say move to the place that was the colonizer, and move there instead to try and have a better life. But it still isn't better, because even though traditional colonialism has ended, it hasn't really. And he brings up this idea that previous idea of assimilation, that it isn't really real, just like it wasn't before. And he says here on page 135, in general, the third world is still afflicted with crushing poverty, corruption, and despotism, which produce cultural sterility, humiliation, resentment, and eventually violence. Basically, things haven't gotten better. All right. Now, this isn't just because of those people who are now in charge. It's also because of the people who did the colonization in the first place. But he's laying his blame on all of them. And I think I'll kind of end off with this quote. It's right near the end. Now, I think just before I do read it, the second book is pretty much about the failures of the decolonial movement, of things could have been better, but it isn't, liberal capitalism has not worked. It creates inequality. Marxism, as it's been implemented, has not worked. And fundamentalism doesn't work either. Yet all of these things are attempted, but they don't work for a myriad of reasons in previously colonized countries. Now, there's a complex mesh of reasons why this is the case. And I can't presume to know it all, because I do not know, political theory to an amazing extent. But basically, this is somewhat of a hopeless book, that things are not getting better. And also, he does speak about, in his afterword, he speaks about how no one really paid attention to the book. Like, it came out, and no one really, cared, in the same sense as his first one. Oh, just hiccuped. Apologies. Yeah, that his first book was, really famous, and this one just kind of, people try to ignore it, because it said some uncomfortable things, that colonialism has ended, traditional colonialism has ended, but things are still terrible. And so we need to actually look beyond that. But I'm going to end on this one, which is basically listing a couple of these countries that were previously colonizer countries, and how they're not actually good. The United States, the promoter of democracy. Russia, once the homeland of the worker. France, the promoter of human rights, are respectively, in exchange for substantial remuneration. I think I said that word wrong. Remunerate, I can't speak. For substantial payment, the three leading global suppliers of arms, which are used to sow death and strengthen tyranny. These countries continue doing essentially the worst thing that they can do, and continue to produce weapons that can be used to harm people. They continue to do this. They continue to perpetuate this. So, not great, probably. Also, people are now hammering outside, and luckily I'm right near the end, so it's fine. But yes, things haven't gone like we thought they were going to go. It was filled with optimism, and the optimism fell away as, I don't want to put any words in his mouth, but, global capitalism continued to exist. So, anyway, I think we'll end it there, because there isn't really an answer to this. It kind of ends just sadly. But that is the end of it. Now, I probably should do Frantz Fanon. Probably. I don't know if I feel comfortable enough actually talking about Frantz Fanon himself. I don't think I know him. I read all of his books, and I'm like, I don't know. I will see. I might do Frantz Fanon. Maybe. We will see. But anyway, if you did like whatever the hell this thing was, this off-the-cuff just discussion about two books and the ideas in them, you can basically look in the description of the video, and I'll give you all the things, Twitter, blog, this is the YouTube channel, some fiction. I'm currently doing interviews with South African indie game devs, which is very, very different to this whole post-colonial discussion we've had, but those are the other things I do. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I hope that everybody has a fantastic time ahead, and if you are interested in these, I think you should give them a read. If you're interested in colonialism, or not so much colonialism, but not colonialism, going against it, they are worth a read. And I believe that is everything. So I hope that you have a fantastic day in the future, ahead of you, whatever, and week and month and year and everything. And yes, goodbye everyone.